Thank you for coming. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Richard Serra. And we have a slightly different format today. We will let you all take in the show. They're great checklists, so please grab one. And then we'll go up to the kitchen on the fourth floor, and Richard will answer questions. So we're not really going to walk through this in a formal way. We'll make it a little more informal. I want to say a couple of words. First about Richard. Richard is certainly no stranger to this town. He started showing in New York in 1969 at the Pastelli Gallery. Has shown you continuously, most recently with big exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art 2007. I think that show was called 40 Years. And then just 2 years ago, 2011, at the Met, an exhibition focusing on the drawings. This show looks at 5 years in Richard's oeuvre, in his production. It really takes his point of departure from the verb list, which is a small but incredibly significant work of art, one of the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, which is exactly that. It's a list of verbs, and these verbs really spell a succession of actions that Richard forced onto the various materials with which he worked, and you can really see these actions in both rooms. And these the verbs and the actions and the relation to the verbs really never leaves the work throughout his career, but it's especially poignant and clear in these early 5 years. The other point of departure for the exhibition is the simple fact that for 5 years, Richard really experimented in a whole variety of materials. There is certainly steel, but there's lead, there's neon, there's rubber, there's wood, there's concrete. So if you see, if you look closely at materials used in these two exhibitions, you see a real range. Whereas in 71, basically with the works you see here, 3 cuts and stripe, Richard settles onto the use of steel pretty much exclusively. So I thought it would be incredibly interesting to illuminate these first 5 years that have such a rich range of expression and that really foreshadow the many great years that came after and the extraordinary larger work that's maybe less object-oriented and more installation specific and of course dealing with architecture. So now I'll let you wander around a little longer, and then we'll all wander up to the 5th floor and hope to see you there. Thank you. So again, thank you, Richard. I forgot to mention a small but important fact. This show has no curator, because when we presented the idea to Richard, he immediately became the curator. So,
well, it's not altogether.
I think that's true. Anyway, so thank you for all the energy you put into the project. And I want to say one more thing that's interesting. A lot of this work downstairs, especially in the first room, was first shown in Europe at Rome Bricka. So, and I think the second room is the show where the space where there's a bunch of work from the Pastelli show in '69. Mm-hmm. But you're such a great American artist. It's interesting to remember that your career really started with exhibitions in Rome and then Cologne. Those were the first major shows. And this work was seen there first. Anyway, so over to questions.
Let me give a little background, just to give you a little context. I went to University of California at Santa Barbara and I majored in English literature. And my main emphasis then was on the transcendentalists, Hawthorne and Emerson, Thoreau. And then that led me into existentialism and particularly Camus, and I wrote a lot on Camus my final year. And I took drawing courses from a man named Howard Warshaw and Rico Lebrun, who were muralists who had studied particularly the Mexicans, Rosco and Siqueiros. And I sent Yale 12 drawings, and they said, we're going to give you a fellowship because we think we can teach you something. However, we want you to get our undergraduate degree in art history. So I went to Yale for 3 years. I was there and got an undergraduate degree in art history. Then I got an MFA and a BA and an MFA. And I was in the same class with Bryce Martin and Chuck Close. And then I got a traveling out of Yale to France and spent a year in France. And then from there I got a Fulbright and went to Italy. When I was in France, I met Phil Glass because he was on a Fulbright also, and I was on the Yale Traveling. We really became close friends. And to make a long story short, when I was I was still a painter at that time, and when I was in Italy, I traveled to the Reina Sofia, not the Prado, and I saw Las Meninas. And I was looking at Las Meninas, and I thought, Jesus, Velázquez is looking at me, and I'm implicated in the space of the painting. And I thought, always I thought of paintings as being in the frame, and what you were looking at was represented or depicted by the object in the frame, and you were the viewer on the outside. And here, Velázquez had created a space where the object-subject thing had changed, where by implication, if I stood there, I was an extension of that space. And I didn't see how I was going to be able to do that in painting unless I resorted to a mirror or whatever. Went back through all my paintings in the Arno and started stuffing animals. And I had a show in Rome of live and stuffed animals. It was like I still considered it student work. It was on a Fulbright. But I met all those people which became part of the Art de Povera movement. I had a live pig in the show. They closed down the show. They said, ignoble brute. We got a flyer and put it back up. But it got me into using materials and a diversity of materials. And when I was at Yale, I took a design course from a man named Neil Welliver, and that course was handed down from Joseph Albers. And one of the things interesting about that course, which really stuck in my mind, is what they impressed upon you was that matter, whatever material you use, is going to impose itself on form. So if you understand the matter, if you're working in plaster, that's going to be very different than you're working in vinyl, which is going to be very different than you're working in lead, which is going to be very different if you're working with steel, even if you make the same object. It doesn't matter. So the material itself, the nature of the material, is going to impose its form on the form. When I came back to New York after working in Europe very loosely with loose material, there was a warehouse on West Broadway that was emptying out all its rubber. And I had a moving company. It was called Low Rate Movers. I think actually there's a rock band in New York called Low Rate Movers now. And it was Phil Glass and myself and Spalding Gray and Steve Reich and Michael Snow and people who just lived in a very local area downtown. And we were able to rotate the truck between us to make a living. And then we all would collect together and have lunches or breakfasts together or whatever. And what was clear about that group of people, and remains true, is that we were all interested in time, we were all interested in the process, and we were all interested in the nature of the material. And it didn't matter if the material was sound or movement and dance or voice or language, or in my case at the time it was rubber and then lead. Phil Glass, who happened to be a plumber at the time, introduced me to lead. So the first thing we did, and we really didn't know what we were doing, is I took a verb list and wrote it down and thought I was going to enact these verbs in relation to space, place, and time. Took a piece of lead, unrolled it, rolled it back up. Thought, well, that can't be too much. So then we took a big sheet of lead, double rolled it, and put it on the floor and thought, okay. Then we took the same piece of lead, rolled it back on itself, and continued to roll it so it made a triple roll. We showed that at the Whitney, and I called it slow roll for Phil Glass. But it got me into the manipulation of how to handle the material. Once you're doing things like that, if you have poles that you're rolling up and you have sheets of lead, it's like the monkey with a banana. You put a piece against the wall, you lean a plate up against it, you pull up against it, and you've got something that looks like, oh, a thing against the wall. I showed a lot of those pieces at a Guggenheim exhibition called the Theodoron, which is about 6 or 7 of them. The problem I had with those pieces is that they still had a pictorial overhang. There were still pieces propped against the wall. And I wanted to get away from that. So with Phil and some help of some other people, we got a tunnel led up to my place on the 6th floor at Greenwich Street. And we stood up the House of Cards. And at that time, there's no fixed joints. And at that time, it didn't look like sculpture. It didn't look like anything. And I was married at the time. My wife came over, she was also a sculptor, to look at it and said, you can't show that. And I said, well, why is that? She said, because that's not art, and it's dangerous, and you're going to hurt somebody, and you're up to no good, and you should stop smoking dope, or whatever she said. And I said, look, I am going to show it, and we got divorced. But the issues were very much fought over at the time, and everybody hung out at Max's Kansas City, and whether it was Andre or Smithson or whomever, the notion of the form, the matter, what people were doing in relation to making and doing in the activity of sculpture was crucial for that period. What was also interesting about that period, there wasn't any cultural industry. this was not there. For probably a good part of you people who work downstairs, you weren't born yet. The people who were doing that work were doing that work for each other. There'd be performances, there'd be things people would go to, they'd pass the hat. I'll give you an example. There was a woman named Simone Forti Whitman. She was doing everybody would hang out at a place called Max's Kansas City. She was doing a performance across the street, 23rd floor. Rauschenberg did a performance, dragging himself around the room in a box with chicken or something. And then outside, there was a light on the 23rd floor that went on. And then they closed off the light in the room you were in. And then a person fell by the window. And then another person fell by the window. And then another, and I was with Michael Snow as a filmmaker. And he said Muybridge. And then another person fell by the window. And another person fell by the window. About 23 people fell by the window, and then the first person fell by the window again. Now, what had happened is that on the 22nd floor, there was a building that stacked mattresses. They'd run up to the 25th floor and jump by, right? And hold themselves in space like that. Those things were going on, and people were doing them for each other. So there was a symbiosis between the collection of poets, filmmakers, painters, sculptors, dancers, choreographers, freaks, who kind of held the thing together, and it wasn't based on the buying and trading and selling of art. Not that I'm against it, I'm certainly implicated in it, in part of it. But the issues then weren't about that. If someone came in and said they sold out a show, people would say, too bad. Because what it meant was that the audience understood what the work was, and the group of people that were kind of trying to foster a new language didn't want their work to look like any other work that had come before. They wanted to go around their predecessors or jump over them or erase them. And it was a group of people who were very much interested in time, process, and matter. And as the work developed, and I worked with Phil, we started just enacting these verbs. The first piece we did to lift down, there's just a piece of rubber we pulled up. And then as the work went on, we did a lot of lead pieces together. All the pieces in the room that are propped, I did with Phil and Dickie Landry and people from that same community who would help drive this truck around with we were moving furniture. And that group of work really developed out of kind of a collective spirit that was very evident with that group of people at that time. The people who were probably the most influenced for all of us were the women, were Yvonne Rainer, Tricia Brown, Simone Forti, Lucinda Childs, in relation to movement, dance, in relation to time, and in relation to material. They would put material on the stage, they would push it across the stage, they'd throw it in the air, they would relate to each other in terms of lifts and jumps, and the timing of those pieces, and that brought the collective together. So I would say at that moment, the people who everyone looked, and they throw parties and dance, but the people that everyone looked to as kind of the leader, and also in film, Yvonne's early films, those people, along with Andy kind of on the side, were the people who were like the prime movers of that scene. I think in terms of this show, I had a show a couple of years ago at the Modern, 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember now. And we showed some of this work. And the Modern had to cordon those pieces off in a certain way where you couldn't quite get close to them. And there was nothing to do other than that because those pieces are hair trigger balanced. I mean, if you just push the end of one, the whole thing's going to collapse. And you can't not do that if you're going to have 5,000 people run through that every day. You've got a waxy floor and a springy floor, and you have children. I think even in this exhibition, we're not going to let children into the prop room because you get a toddler running in there and we're in trouble. I think probably I said a mouthful. Anybody who wants to open it up to questions, I'm available.
Could you say something about the literary connections? I mean, your relationship to words. I mean, obviously you started out with studying literature and...
I think if you're interested early on in Hawthorne and particularly Emerson, you come to rely on your own experience. And if you start relying on your own experience in terms of your own sensation, and I think one of the reasons I got interested in art is I wanted an alternative life. And I wanted a way to study my own sensations and not have to be bothered with anybody else. And as a kid, I worked in steel mills, so I knew what punching the clock was and I knew what sweat labor was. And I decided I didn't want to do that. Really what I wanted to do was find the time and place to study my own experience. And I thought making and doing art would enable me to do that. I had no notion that I would ever end up being an artist of any recognition. That wasn't what entered my head. But I knew I wanted an alternative lifestyle other than working for somebody else. And since I was a kid, I always drew. It was something I did every night. It was something my parents encouraged, and that's what got me into Yale. And it was something, it's always been the touchstone of how I understood the world. So it was something that I still do whenever I can, and I do it in a notebook daily. So it's part of my life. But did I answer your question? Well, if you go on with the literature led me from that right into the existentialists. Sartre, Camus, and then the film, you know, Marion Bad René, and then I went to Paris and looked at all those new wave filmmakers. But I think it's not a big leap to go from the transcendentalist to the existentialist, and that's pretty much my grounding. And I'm still very involved with my own feedback in relation to my own sensations and my own experience, and my own intuition.
So the second part of the question was to understand, like, your interest in verbs and words, and how you work with that in regards to your structure.
I wanted a proposition that would enable me to work without getting into the subjectivity of my taste. So I wanted to be able to set up just a simple order of doing things where I didn't have to worry about, oh, I like this one better than that one, or I should put the red over here and the green over there. And the interesting thing, when you start doing things like that and you get into the problem of actually constructing, if you have to make a construction, the actual fact of pulling the thing together, whether it's the house of cards or 530 with the poles balancing the thing that's underneath, you have to do it with the most parsimonious, least complicated way to make it efficient, so you have to resolve the problem. Resolving the problem doesn't have anything to do with your subjective taste, it's just getting the job done. And that removes you from not only the history of a certain kind of structure that relies on composition, that's out of the game, because what you're really interested in is resolving the problems that you've set up for yourself in relationship to how to deal with the feedback that's necessary to resolve the solution to the problem. Now, it may not be interesting as art, I don't know, but it can become interesting to art if the problem interests other people, but there are certainly no guarantees. When I was putting up this show, that really did occur to me, because all these people who were putting the show up were not alive when the show was when I did these work, and I was wondering, what the hell do these people think? I had no idea. I mean, there's no way to know. And there aren't any guarantees, and no one gets perpetuity, so you don't know.
You said back then, when the show was sold out, you said too bad, so it was all about pushing boundaries, and something
Well,
that
it just
sold
meant,
out was...
it meant for the group of people that I was involved with, if somebody came into Max's, you know, with a white suit on and shiny shoes and said, I just sold out my show, we thought, oh, fuck. You know, you thought, like, obviously, there's collectors that know what this work's about, so it can't be any good. If people are buying the work, it can't be any good. That's the group of people I was with understood that, intrinsically understood that.
What about your collectors?
I didn't have any. I sold, this is really interesting. Some of those works are in museums now. I sold 4 of them for $800. Actually, one of the guys was here. Casper Koenig was here. Actually, he was here at the time. He helped pull the deal. But there was a dealer at the time named Dick Bellamy who ran the Green Gallery. And he showed in this series of about a year, he showed Oldenburg, Morris, Flavin, Judd, Samaras, De Suvro, on and on and on. And then they were all picked up either by Castelli or, can't remember the other gallery, Janus. But he really fostered the whole scene, and he became, I think if you're a young artist and you come to New York and you don't know anybody, New York is either like a fortress or a traffic accident. You have to really either hide out or get out there. And Bellamy became both my witness and my messenger. And he was like half Chinese and half Scotch, and he was a poet, and he was a doper, and he was a really close friend of mine, and I miss him dearly.
Can you tell the story of how you got to Strike? That's the scale change from the prop pieces up to the sort of first large-scale steel work?
Yeah, I was Jasper Johns had seen a splash piece I had done at the Whitney, And he wanted me to do it in his loft, and he had a loft on Delancey Street. And I went over there with Phil, and we started heating up the lead. And we had a big piece of lead that we were going to chop up and put in and heat up in the cauldron. And we took it and we shoved it into the corner. And we thought, Jesus Christ, it stood up. We thought, what's holding that up? And we thought, oh, the junction of the right angle of the corner is holding the lead up. And so we went ahead and made the piece for John. We used it as a device to splash against to overturn triangles. If you have a piece in a corner like that, you splash against it, you turn it over, and you have a triangle. We did it on both sides. And the piece, John's liked it a lot. We were all very happy. And then John's had Cage come over. It was great for Phil and I because we got to hang out and have lunch with John and Cage for about 4 days. And it was sublime. But it gave me the idea that I should just go get a plate and put it in the corner. And I did, and I found a rigging crew who I worked with, was called Ray LaChapelle and Sons, and I'm still working with their son now, they were on a company called Budco. So I've been with the same rigging crew for about, I don't know, over 40 years. And they are really like an extension of my hand, because without them, nothing happens. But so it went from seeing in the work a possibility of another work, and as soon as that work came about, then you're out of the studio and you're into installations, you're into context, you're into the room, you're into walking around time, space, and then whatever the container is becomes, as you walk into it, the space and place of the work. So there's a man called Harold Zeman who saw that piece, and that piece went up around 70, 71. He was doing Documenta in 72. He said, will you come to Documenta? What do you want to do? And it was a hard time for me because it was an accident. A guy got killed at the same time. I was completely, my head was off and I didn't know what to do. And I said, oh, here, I'll do 4 plates out of 4 corners. He said, fine, Richard, done. And it was really a relief for me because it gave me a big boost of confidence. Went to Documenta and put that piece up. And that piece is now in Europe. Modern has a smaller version of it.
Can you talk about how Tilted Art, how that fiasco affected you in your career?
It pissed me off. It was like a saga. It was like, it divided the art world. My life got threatened. It was nasty. It put me totally at odds with my government and my country. It made a lot of people who were sitting on the fence. It was strange. I mean, people who stood by you. Other people who wanted to be politically correct didn't. The meeting that they had, which was this kind of kangaroo court, was interesting for me because a big part of the art world came and stood up for me. But then there were other people who were in museum culture, namely the Met, who came down against the piece. So people had to, hide their ass or whatever it was. People took sides. It was nasty. I mean, I would never work for the government again, ever. I mean, they've asked me to build pieces for embassies. I'd never do it. I'd never sign up for the government.
Where is the piece now?
It's in a police parking lot, flattened out.
How did you make the transition from using all different materials, and why did you select steel finally?
As a kid, I worked with steel. I caught rivets for Bethlehem Steel. I put up a building in San Francisco called the Crown Zellerbach building. So I knew a lot about it. And when I had to move into steel, I thought, I'm not going to do that. It's the most traditional material you can possibly use. But if you look at the history of steel sculpture up to that point, it goes from Gonzalez to Picasso, Calder, or whomever. The way that it had been used was to put a fulcrum into the ground, and the balance was always false. And they hung the steel out like it was a 3D painting. And that was the nature of cut and folded steel up to probably post-war. And then if you look at most of the minimalists, who my generation came right after, no one calls them that, but they were interested in construction. I mean, if you look at LeWitt, Judd, they're still constructivists. I mean, that's where they come right out of Russia in a certain sense. And the lead pieces are basically still constructions. And to move into steel, for me, was something I knew about, and I realized that no one had ever used it in the way that I understood the Industrial Revolution used it. The Industrial Revolution used it for its stasis, for its load-bearing capacity, for its weight, for its measure. But nobody in the art world had used it that way. They used it to make 3D paintings. You hang a figure in the space, or you cut and fold and whatever. And Smith did a little better, looking at Picasso. And Picasso maybe had 10 or 12 years of sculpture, but probably some of the greatest sculpture of the century. When I first started, I looked very, very carefully at Brancusi, because for a young student, if you want to move into sculpture, Brancusi is like a handbook, because it's all available, whether you want to look at abstraction or figuration or how he cuts a form into a space. I think every sculptor, you can't get around them. You have to go through them. And then when I was in Paris with Phil, we'd go every night, and Giacometti was there. He was alive and real, and we would look at him, and we were groupies. And the thing, I didn't want to make Giacometti's, but what was interesting about Giacometti is Giacometti, more so than any artist I can think of, represented the studio. He represented actually the existential guy in the studio, you know, screwing around with clay every day and throwing it away and doing it again every day and throwing it away, and he would come in there with plaster stuck in his hair. And, you know, you can have for teachers, and I had Stella and Gustin and Rauschenberg and whomever for teachers at Yale, Reinhardt, and there was something very different about looking at Giacometti every night, because you realized this was a guy who just stepped out of the door and he was having his dinner and he was working and it was a different notion of what it meant to be a sculptor. And to tell you the truth, I'd never really thought about making sculpture until at that point. I think going to Paris and looking at Brancusi and seeing Giacometti, I thought, well, I don't know if there's an opening there for me, but then after I saw Las Meninas, I said, that's the hell with painting, I'm gonna try to do something else. It was like an epiphany, actually.
How did Carl Andre fit into that story?
When I was first in New York, I was much more interested in, Judd was completely supportive, but I was more interested in Andre than I was Judd, because Andre is interested in the nature of the matter. Andre is interested in material. Judd's interested in the effect of the material. Andre's interested in the physicality of the material. So if Andre deals with copper or lead or zinc or magnesium, it's really about the valence chart of the load and the pressure of the material, either underfoot or on the ground. It's not the effect of the material in relation to your eye. So even though I totally admire Judd, Judd for me still remains someone who's coming off the wall out of Newman, still involved with pictorial illusion in relation to painting. Great, great sculptor, probably one of the better sculptors of the second half of the century. But for my own personal notion of making sculpture, I was much more interested in Andre and much closer to Andre. And at that time, my best friend was Smithson. And Smithson and Judd, as much as I got along with Judd, and Judd was very supportive, Smithson and Judd hated each other. And Smithson was my closest friend. But, you know, so I was right in between those two guys.
Are you going to be going to the 40th anniversary of the Amarillo Ramp?
No.
Did you finish that project?
No, when I went there, Smithson had like a question mark out in the water. And I was on my way to Japan. And I said, Bob, that's ubu-wa. You can't do a question mark in the water. And there's a photograph of me standing there, and he's drawing a spiral. And I'm standing there right next to him, he's drawing the spiral. And so that day, we went together, and we took like a string, like, you know, fishing line string, and we walked it out. One person would walk 2 steps, and one person would walk 1 step, 3 steps, 2 steps, 5 steps, like that. And we just kept walking it out till we staked it out. And we staked it out, and then I left. I never saw it finished, but I helped him stake it out. And I knew when he was staking it out, I thought, this guy's really up to something. And then after he died, I went and finished the Amarillo Ramp for him.
How has the experience of architecture affected your larger scale works or influenced you in that way?
I think the things, you see, once you get out of the studio and you get out into the world of the urban environment, of the landscape, you have to deal with the comparisons of what else is out there. And the other thing that's out there is buildings and architecture. So you have to take what that urban feedback is in relationship to what you do. So a lot of the contexts that I've worked in have to do with pieces related to or in architecture. And there, you either have to critique the architecture or find a way to bring the space and turn it into one of a sculptural volume, not an architectural volume. And when you do that, often architects get annoyed. But so I've spent a great deal of time looking at architecture. In fact, probably Renshaw and Hagia Sophia have had as much influence on me as any sculptor, for sure. Particularly Renshaw. Which I think, if anybody who's been to Renshaw, it's a very small space, but you walk in there and you can physically touch the space. I mean, it has a volume that's palpable. It has a weight that's palpable. And Hagia Sophia, the same.
Is there early work that you thought was particularly successful at achieving the effect you wanted?
Should be in the show.
Was there an early work in the show or not that you felt at the time was particularly successful at achieving the effect you wanted?
I'm not quite. Are you asking me to qualify which works better than not, or?
No, just I'm curious about when you were creating and you had something that thought, yes, this is exactly what I was trying to achieve. If something really sort of spoke to you that way, or maybe you felt that way with all of your work, so maybe you didn't think about it.
I don't think of it in those terms. You go through a body of work, and some works like resolve probabilities and possibilities for you. They may even be didactic in and of themselves, and they may not lead to other things, and they may have to take a long time with seepage. If you take 2-lift, for instance, that's a topological form. That's a curve. I didn't get back into curves until about 30 years later, and I didn't even know what the word topology was at the time. But it's a continuous in and out form, and so the surface is continuous, and at the time I didn't know that. So that work, in terms of leading in my own work to something that I could have foreseen, I would say it's almost like a prime object for me. House of Cards, the same. But I don't distinguish between, like, you know, I mean, some of the older work there, I was happy. Some of the work that I had done at the time that I didn't think was particularly relevant, I look at it now and I think, Jesus, why did I not like that piece? I mean, there were a couple of pieces down there I hadn't seen in 40 years, and I thought, oh, I'm glad I did that one. But you don't know. I think it's curious about artists. They're so attached to the last work they've done that they're usually not the best judge of their own work.
How would you compare your practice today to back in the days? You know, it sounded you're playing with your artist friends, you do all these experiments, you were in this large group of artists influencing each other. So what is it today?
I have my rituals. Yeah, I have a certain working ethic that I go through every day. I mean, it's certainly not the same in terms of cross-fertilization, but I think every generation finds themselves, and every generation then identifies themselves, and they move out and they do their own work. I mean, you know, I think one thing for Phil, it was great that Phil, because of the nature of his work, was able to collaborate. And I think his relationship to Wilson was very, very instrumental. It's like Cage and Cunningham. I think they were able to take something by the symbiosis of bringing them together, particularly with Lucinda, that moved them on to a place they couldn't have been if they didn't work with each other. So in a sense, they benefited from the early kind of collaborations, and Phil continues to collaborate with anybody and everybody, and he would almost rather collaborate than do singular work. The kind of work I do is much more related to the proposition of a context, the possibility of working. Right now I've been working in Qatar. We've had possibilities of working on a scale I hadn't worked before. And I just came off working on a piece in Brazil, big piece. So you look for the possibilities that'll enable you to extend your work. But in terms of working with a collective group of people, I don't do that any longer. Now we work with lawyers. It's true.
In thinking about the nature of the material, am I remembering correctly that there was situations where when you were conceptualizing works, you consulted with fabricators or engineers and told them what you wanted, and they just said impossible, and you just moved on to someone else who was able to do it?
No, in engineering, when I first started working, I had an engineer, his name was Malcolm Graff, and I would tell him what I was doing, and he said, that won't stand up. So I'd make the model and bring it to him and say, here. Right? Because engineers have books, right? And the books have tendency to overturn propositions in them. And there's certain things that you can't do. But if you do them and you show them and they work, then they have to rewrite what the law is so you can do it. Because in the same laws that apply to sculpture don't necessarily apply to buildings, because you can't build buildings out of pieces that aren't fastened. I mean, no way you're going to be able to do that. But there are principles there that are the same. If you look at keystones, the way they were built in early arches, there's no joint in the keystone. So there's a lot of dolmens, the same thing, overhead. There's a lot of very primitive building, which is the basis of architecture and shelters, actually, that's involved with tectonic structures that would never pass a code today. Okay, I think it's a wrap. Thanks.
Thank you.